Hello, good afternoon, everyone. We will wait maybe a minute or two to see whether some more people join us. So bear with us, please. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Buenos dias to those of you who are following us from Chile and Latin America in general. My name is Koldo Kasla, and I'm a lecturer at the School of Law of the University of Essex and a member of the Human Rights Center here at Essex. And it's an honor for me to introduce to you this event today of the Human Rights series of the Human Rights Center of Essex. The event has as a title, From Pinochet's Economic Accomplices to Inequality in Chile Today. Chile is one of the countries that we are doing a lot of work on here at the Human Rights Center, and I would like to mention a couple of things about a couple of projects that we are busy with this year. We are working alongside our partners in Chile. Ahora nos toca participar on drawing some lessons from comparative practice of participatory approaches to constitutional reform in the context of the exciting process of reform that Chile is going through in the last 2 years or so. And we are also working alongside colleagues from University of Concepcion in Chile and the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, learning from comparative approaches to constitutionalizing economic and social rights and trying to draw some lessons from international comparative practice that might be explored in Chile as well. Chile is one of the most unequal countries in the OECD, and Juan Mendez, former Special Rapporteur on Torture, said that it was the lack of accountability for economic actors and the responsibility on keeping unequal structures in the country is one of the reasons why Juan Mendez calls it an unfinished transition to democracy, despite having done more than most of the countries for truth, or many other countries for truth, justice, and reparations. So today we have an exceptional panel to talk about this, and also to present this book to you, Pinochet's Economic Accomplices, An Unequal Country by Force, a book edited by Juan Pablo Bohoslavsky, Karina Fernandez, and Sebastian Smuts. And indeed, we have Juan Pablo himself, co-editor of the book, in the panel today, and two of the authors of the book. Let me introduce the panel. To you. Juan Pablo Bohoslavsky was the United Nations Independent Expert on Debt and Human Rights between 2014 and 2020. He has written books and articles on responsibility for economic complicity with human rights violations, and he previously worked for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and the Argentinian state. He has been consultant for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and for the Economic Community for Latin America and the Caribbean, the Economic Commission. Lee Payne is Professor of Sociology and Latin America and St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. She works on transitional justice and human rights in general, and she has recently published the book Transitional Justice and Corporate Accountability from Below, deploying Archimedes' Lever with her co-authors Gabriel Pereira and Laura Bernal Bermudez, published by Cambridge University Press. And finally, we have Carla Moscoso. Carla holds a BA in Sociology and an MA in Political Communication from the University of Chile. Currently, Carla works at Chile's National Preventive Mechanism Against Torture. She previously worked for the Ministry of Governmental Affairs, the National Council of Television, Chilean Transparency Council, the UNDP, and Chile's National Human Rights Institution. Each one of them is going to talk to you for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to have time for Q&A. Juan Pablo will go first, and Juan Pablo will present the main findings and arguments of the book, and he will connect the structures of economic complicity, Pinochet's legacy in terms of socioeconomic inequality, and the current constitutional process. Lee is gonna give us an opportunity to put it in context of a global context, and Lee will cover the key findings from the Global Corporate Accountability and Transitional Justice database. And thirdly, Carla will address Chile's inequality in the hands of economic actors, connecting that with two important phenomena that are going on simultaneously at the moment in Chile. One of them is global, COVID-19, and the other one is the process of constitutional reform, and in particular, the government's political intervention against a TV channel because of a parody of armed forces. So she will connect the argument of the book with COVID-19 and social mobilization at the moment in Chile. So without further ado, Juan Pablo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Great. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody there. Thanks a lot, Coldo, and the University of Essex Human Rights Center for organizing this panel to present and discuss the book today entitled Pinochet's Economic Accomplices and an Equal Country by Force. This is a collective book that unravels the role that economic actors played during the Pinochet's dictatorship. The book was written by 28 experts and scholars, and I would like to highlight the gender parity and the ideological, disciplinary, and geographical plurality of these contributors. The book explains or tries to explain the role of economic accomplices from a systematic and interdisciplinary perspective. So the book tries to contribute to the historical narrative of the Chilean dictatorship, given that the issue of responsibility of corporations has been absent in the public debates around the recent past in Chile. The role played by economic actors in the context of authoritarian regimes is even more important than in democracies. There is a rational explanation for that. Authoritarian governments have a structural legitimacy deficit, and this is why they need to show certain economic success in order to perpetuate over time. Then it's not surprising that quantitative analysis have established that the more the financial assistance and foreign direct investment regimes receive, the longer their political lives. Authoritarian regimes have basically two resources to consolidate their power and carry out their plans: buying loyalties and repressing. And this is a rational choice approach in the theoretical framework proposed by the book. Regarding the repression in Chile, well known by all, and its link to the available governmental resources, we must recall that in a context of fiscal austerity during the dictatorship, with social expenditures continuously being cut, defense and policy expenditures did grow. And here we need to keep in mind the colossal increase of the external debt, which had the key role in the consolidation of the economic model and therefore in the functioning of the bureaucratic criminal machinery and also in buying loyalties. Tools and channels through which economic resources were allocated in a very strategic manner, that means to get the support from powerful key sectors of the Chilean society, included policies in a number of areas, such as tax, budget, industry, forest, mining, banks, international trade, urbanism, privatization of state-owned companies, as well as pensions. So the chapters of the book study all these policies that were implemented during the dictatorship. The book, through its chapters, explains in detail how each of these policies worked in practice. The common denominator of these policies was the economic benefit granted to Chilean elites and big national and foreign corporations, which increased inequality in the country. The same corporations or their institutional representatives usually had a complicit role. Their public statements minimizing or even justifying the crimes was something not unusual during those years. This dynamic was also obvious regarding many journalists, mass media, think tanks, and scholars whose complicit behavior is explained not only by ideological and political alignments, but also by the economic benefits that they received. The perpetration of economic crimes that benefited military personnel and businessmen were another efficient instrument to allocate resources and buy loyalties. The radical and quick transfer of national wealth in favor of business community to the detriment of workers, that was translated into a brutal increase of social and economic inequality, was a result of the imposition of a neoliberal economic policy. Social discontent was contained through state violence against unions leaders and through weakening the collective bargaining power of unions, which was obviously translated into a great deterioration of the working conditions, including wages. As Antonio Cassese explained in his report on this issue, economic assistance reinforced the regime and facilitated the perpetration of crimes against humanity, while the neoliberal economic model imposed attract more investments given the high revenues ensured. But what is, both conceptually and legally, economic complicity with human rights violations? It's about, as the International Commission of Jurists explains in its 2008 report on this specific topic, the contributions that enable, exacerbate, or facilitate human rights violations. So in this way, there was in Chile a wide range of economic complicit behaviors, from requesting the policy forces to assassinate unions leaders, to order facilities and trucks to kidnap and torture, provide massive financial assistance to the government without asking too many questions, manipulate journalistic information to ensure impunity to the perpetrators, to develop scientific arguments that justified social exclusion and repressive policies. The book explains the legal implications of these actions. The Chilean agenda on truth, memory, justice, compensation, and non-repetition has focused its discursive, legal, political, and also institutional efforts almost exclusively on blood crimes, marginalizing the role of and possible responsibility of economic accomplices. So the debate around the economic rationale that was behind the dictatorship has been rather limited and mostly focused on the illicit enrichment of the Pinochet family and some other cases of state corruptions. And one of the findings of this book is precisely that the physiognomy of the Chilean economy imposed by the dictatorship, by force, which benefited a few at the expense of the majority of the populations, is still in place. This fact explains to a great extent why, towards the end of 2019, millions of Chileans protested in the street against the brutal levels of inequality, and why the state reacted with cruel repression against them. Again, in May 2020, the most disadvantaged groups hit harder by the COVID-induced crisis are repressed in the streets when claiming that due to the economic impact, they are suffering from hunger. Actually, this was one of the main findings of the report prepared by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights regarding the visit conducted between October and November 2019. The main cause of the social unrest is precisely the extreme social and economic inequality, as well as the obstacle for the full realization of economic and social rights for all. The political and economic power of the corporate accomplices of the dictatorships shaped the Chilean constitution created in 1980 during the Pinochet government. It has one of the most regressive declarations of economic, social, and cultural rights in the region, with practically no reference to social justice. I'm sure Coldo can tell you much more on this, as he's about publishing a book on the new Chilean constitution. Anyway, this is why, in the context of the ongoing constitutional reform process in Chile, recognizing the highest legal status of economics and social rights, as well as democratizing the generation and distribution of resources in the country to ensure the realization of these rights, is intrinsically linked to the accountability of the dictatorship economic accomplices. I will stop here so there's time for discussion. Many thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Juan Pablo. Lee, I want to give the floor to you, but just for everyone's sake, if you want to ask questions, there's a function at the bottom, the Q&A function. So feel free to type your questions there, and we will get back to them later. So, Lee.
Thank you so much, Coldo. Let me just bring up this slideshow. For some reason here we go. Thank you, Coldo, and thank you, the University of Essex and the Human Rights Center in particular, for this opportunity to present the book that Juan Pablo and Karina and Sebastian put together. It was I want to also thank those editors. It was such an exciting process to participate in. We had the opportunity to meet in different venues and to really discuss some of our shared interests around this area of economic actors' complicity. So I wanted to share with you all the participation that I was able to give to the book, together with my co-authors, Gabriel Pereira and Laura Bernal Bermudez, who unfortunately weren't able to come and participate in the meeting today. So I will be presenting in brief what I guess is like a book within a book, because the chapter that we wrote for the book, it was part of a larger project that we were working on at the time, although the Chile book came out before our book, which I put up here on this screen in a shameless self-promotion of the book. This book is being translated into Spanish, and the Spanish version is going to be available for free. So if you're interested, just send me a message and we will make this available to you. So the question behind the project in the book on Chile, but also in our larger project, is how has transitional justice addressed economic actors' complicity in gross human rights violations? We really were dealing with the blood crimes that Juan Pablo was just talking about. In other words, the direct and indirect participation of economic actors, private and public economic actors, in the complicity of those crimes against humanity. We constructed a database called the Corporate Accountability and Transitional Justice Database. This was a collaborative project with a number of actors in Latin America and in Europe and the US to try and track the different accountability measures that had been used for looking at corporate accountability. We actually didn't expect to find anything. And so what I'm going to talk about is some of the surprises that we came up with in our study of the different transitional justice mechanisms and in dealing with corporate complicity. The first thing was that there has been accountability for economic actors in crimes against humanity. And since the very beginning of the notion of transitional justice after the Holocaust, many of us know about the Nuremberg trials, the trials of doctors, but also the trials of certain economic actors. And so what we wanted to document with our study of the historical cases is that from the beginning of transitional justice, there has also been investigation into and accountability for economic actors. That was dropped along the way is one of the things that we assumed had happened. But in fact, when we looked at each of the what we could call standard transitional justice mechanisms, truth commissions, international trials, foreign trials, domestic trials, we still see that there are economic actors held accountable in these transitional justice mechanisms. It hasn't been consistent over time, and there's been a lot of variation in the context that has made it more possible or less possible to advance these accountability efforts. What we've also found is surprises that this has happened without even transitional justice experts knowing that it was happening. There's a lack of visibility. There's a lack of really systematically analyzing what has been used. What are the tools available to hold corporate accountability, to make corporate accountability possible? And we've also found that when this has happened, it's also happened without mandates in truth commissions, and without clear, binding, and enforceable international law that can be used in domestic processes as well as in foreign and international processes. That has occurred is actually a surprise in and of itself, given the lack of a clear, binding, and enforceable international law regarding the human rights obligations of economic actors. But the other surprise is that Latin America was a protagonist of these processes. There are more truth commissions in Latin America that named economic actors by name. The highest number of truth commissions that named economic actors for their complicity in, this is only counting the crimes against humanity, were in Brazil and Guatemala. We also find that there are more judicial actions with more guilty verdicts in Latin America than in other regions of the world. And I've put some tables for the truth commissions, the judicial actions at the bottom of this slide. And this has happened in a region and in a world, in a global context in which economic actors are extremely powerful. So it's happened even when there have been veto players from the corporate actors at the global level and the domestic level. And I think, given what Juan Pablo just presented about the context of Chile, you could agree that there were very powerful economic actors coming out of the dictatorship that might have thwarted this process in Chile and didn't. So it's a good example of how to overcome even this veto power of the economic community. What we found is perhaps not a surprise, given this context, is that where this happens, where this accountability efforts have happened, it's happened from below. This is justice from below. It's from below in the sense of the global South, struggling against transnational corporations in the global North. It's happened without international pressure, like we did see in the accountability processes for state actors that depended on transnational advocacy networks. It also has happened from below in a way that's very different than what the business and human rights literature has argued for trying these cases in foreign courts in the US, in the UK, in France, in Switzerland. It's happened by very mobilized civil society actors, that means from below, and their institutional interlocutors or innovators that have made it possible to have their voices heard and to translate those voices into accountability efforts. So that's a very quick overview. In our argument about how this happens, this process from below, is a kind of metaphor that we use for Archimedes' lever. If you remember Archimedes' a statement that give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I can move the world. And so what we're arguing is that even very weak actors, victims in the global South, victims of corporate human rights violations in the global South, with the right tools and the specific placement of the fulcrum, or in a particular context, can lift even this heavy weight of corporate accountability. So the weak actors are obvious from the description of the study. The right tools have been these institutional innovators who found ways of blending very specific kinds of domestic laws, like labor law, protection of workers' safety in a factory, with international human rights obligations in terms of not suspending statute of limitations, so that a disappearance that occurred in the 1970s can be investigated long after labor law would still apply, because it is a crime against humanity. This blending of very ordinary domestic law with international human rights law is the kind of institutional innovation that we were finding. The fulcrum is the context, and the context is constantly changing. We could say that maybe some of the the initial advances in Latin America occurred under the so-called pink tide governments that could in some cases be lapse during electoral changes towards more conservative governments. But we're seeing that even under these conservative governments, there have been efforts by civil society actors and institutional innovators to apply pressure on that lever to lift up corporate accountability. That corporate accountability is held down, that weight is being held down by these very powerful economic actors, what we call the veto power of economic actors over this process of accountability. This is very brief, but I can come back and explain any of this that is not clear. But I wanted to get to the case of Chile. As Juan Pablo explained in his overview, the coup and the dictatorship was really created a very favorable context, was in fact, we could say, designed to benefit private economic interests. The whole purpose behind the coup and the dictatorship was really this economic interest. And as a result, we have the emergence of very powerful veto players during the dictatorship and continuing long after the transition, as we can see in Chile today. Nonetheless, even in this context with very powerful veto players, we had two truth commissions in Chile that both named economic actors for their involvement in gross human rights violations. In the Rettig Commission, we had 14 companies named. In the Valek 1 Commission, we had 2 companies named. And we could make the argument that perhaps these names appear in the Truth Commission reports because nobody knew that they were there, right? So it didn't mobilize the kind of economic actors that might have mobilized, and as we're seeing, have mobilized in the case of Colombia, where it's been from the very beginning, the idea of including economic actors in the Truth Commission and in the special prosecution in the HEP. We also have 7 cases of judicial actions or trials in Chile, but so far, only 1 conviction. Now, this may not seem like a lot, given the degree of complicity that Juan Pablo set out in his presentation, but it's gone much further in judicial action, Chile has, than most countries in the world. There are a couple of exceptions like Argentina and Colombia, but Chile is up there as one of the above the median in terms of judicial action. We also have a particular case, the one conviction of the Pioneer Massacre that I think is emblematic of the kinds of difficulties in bringing these cases, but also the possibilities of success, the hope for accountability for victims of crimes against humanity in which economic actors were complicit in, and in this case could be said to be the drivers of that violence. Just to give you a brief background on the Pioneer Massacre, the community of Pioneer, a rural community outside of Santiago, was very active during the efforts at establishing agrarian reform in the 1970s and earlier under the Frei and Allende governments. And were considered to be, because they were very linked to the MIR, were also trying to push those agrarian reform policies further than perhaps the governments wanted to go. They were successful in agrarian reform, but right after the 11th of September coup, there was also a massacre of the Pioneer community, and a number of about 1,000 is mentioned in terms of those who were involved, who were victims of this massacre, but the count is still unclear. That occurred on the 18th of September, so a week after the Pinochet coup, or the coup d'etat in Chile. And a year later, the community members tried to retrieve the bodies that were essentially dumped in an abandoned area, and they were denied that opportunity. They continued to struggle for the return of the bodies, for some kind of justice. And finally, in 1989, they created their own Agrupación de Familiares de los Detenidos y Desaparecidos en Pioneer, to really pursue this accountability effort. In 2008, the memorial was constructed, and I've included a few pictures here from the website, the Facebook page of the Agrupación. And then this eventually led to, this mobilization led to the conviction of Juan Francisco Lusoro Montenegro for 4 homicides and 1 attempted homicide in the Pioneer Massacre. This is an unprecedented decision in Chile. He was the first civilian. He was the first economic actor held accountable. We don't know whether he will be the last, but it was certainly an unprecedented account at the time. So what I wanted to talk about is, how was this possible? How is it possible to bring this kind of accountability for the massacre at Pioneer and the involvement of economic actors in attempting to roll back, to really take back the agrarian reform and privatize those lands again in this community, this isolated community in outside of Santiago. So going back to our framework, we argue that the first part of this, it initiates with the civil society demand, the mobilization by the Pioneer community, which now is 3 generations of families demanding justice. The one survivor, the attempted homicide, is a survivor who was able to make testimony, Alejandro Bustos, who you can see in the bottom photograph, because he was supposed to have been killed, but saved himself by being underneath one of the bodies of the community member who was killed. He was able to testify to everything that happened in that massacre. This was also picked up by the Londres 38 NGO that has worked with the community of Pioneer. So it not only was the community organized, they were themselves, but they were also working with other NGOs to try and magnify the demand for justice. Had they operated completely on their own without institutional innovators, this might never have moved forward. So I think it's important to think about how communities have to make this demand and consistently participating in different public activities and also in every single stage of the judicial action to eventually be heard and be heard by some of these institutional innovators that can translate the demand into legal language and legal processes. So it's important that the Supreme Court judge that was given this case was Marianela Cifuentes Alarcón, because not all of the Supreme Court judges would have been able to think about translating these demands, given the still de jure amnesty law in Chile, into a conviction of Lusoro, 20 years in prison, and also the payment for civil damages to victims. But these veto players may not have played a significant role in this case than they might in others, because Lusoro was not what you would call a powerful landholder. He was the head of a truck driver company. He was there and present during the violations, during the massacre, but so were others. And the name of one of the powerful families that comes out of the Chile case, the Cast family, there are witnesses who saw Cast in the same setting, but no one has been able to associate him directly with the violence, but rather the complicity in the massacre that took place. That case has not moved forward. The other context that I think is important is that this all occurred during a time when the Supreme Court was probably least, if there is a period of time when the Supreme Court would be least, it was not a Supreme Court that was packed with human rights promoters. In fact, they're a very small minority in the Supreme Court. So part of the context was who got this case and the role that Cifuentes played in that. Whether other cases will have this kind of context in which they evolve, it remains to be seen. So just to quickly conclude, one of the worries could be that this is a singular case rather than a landmark case, that the components of this case were so unique, the way they lined up, that we might not see the same kind of outcome or possibilities for other cases that have been discussed with the idea of bringing them forward. The famous case of the Papalera, like the case of Paine, is seen as emblematic because of the violation of workers in the in the paper mill, but also in the village and the community around it, including those working for the trains, etc. This has not had as much success in advancing than other cases. There's also a very interesting case that that we've talked with different civil society groups in Chile about, thinking about how to move forward, which is the case of Marta Lidia Ugarte Roman. I put the newspaper story about her. This would be an interesting case of looking at the media and the role that the media played in covering up what were clear violations of human rights. Her body washed up on the shore. There was no doubt that there was every indication that she had been tortured, that she had been detained and disappeared. And yet when her body washed up, it was presented as a crime of passion rather than, and covering up the role that the repressive apparatus had played in her murder. So how I would like to conclude is that these cases don't always move forward. In fact, I presented these surprises like this has been a very dramatic shift. There are actually very few cases of advancing accountability. But what I want to emphasize is the kind of hope that with civil society demand for accountability and putting the tools, these human rights tools, in the hands of institutional innovators, especially in propitious contexts, we can see some advancing of this of these accountability efforts for corporate actors engaged in human rights violations. We're hoping that with some movement that's happening in the future, that we might also be able to count on more pressure from outside countries to amplify these demands for justice for gross human rights violations, to begin to construct, as the treaty process that's underway may be able to do, the kind of clear, binding, and enforceable human rights obligations on business that have been what has allowed for accountability of state actors around the world. So with that, I will close and thank you again for your interest, and hope that I can answer any questions or fill any gaps that I've left out. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Lee, for sharing this interesting and indeed surprising findings with us. I'm sure we'll have the chance to talk about it in the Q&A session. Also, your research is a reason for optimism, isn't it? It's a reason to be to believe that things can change when there is the right mobilizing structure and political opportunity in place.
You got me on a good day.
Yes. But we always need that energy, don't we? So well done there. And the third speaker is Carla Moscoso. Carla.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for Juan Pablo and Lee presentations. I'd like to show you a very short video. It's quite heartbreaking, but I think it represents what happened with the social outbreak in Chile and the foundations of the problems. Why this constitutional process is happening now. So I'll share my screen here. It has English subtitles.
Para entender la historia de mi familia, es preciso conocer la historia de Chile. Mis padres son de clase media baja, ambos profesores. Se conocieron en dictadura y formaron familia en medio del horror.
Estamos en una guerra, que no ha terminado la guerra.
En 1987 nació mi hermana Carol y 2 años después nací yo. Ni yo ni mi hermana recordamos ese tiempo, pero siempre pudimos sentir el miedo de nuestros padres. 8 años después, inesperadamente llegó Gustavo, el último de los hermanos. Creció lleno de cariño. Sin embargo, en 2006, la tragedia apareció en mi familia. Carol, mi hermana, enfermó gravemente y 1 año después falleció. A contar de ese momento, asumí el rol de hermano mayor y nunca volví a separarme de Gustavo.
La tarde de este viernes, Gustavo Gatica, de 21 años, recibió un impacto en el rostro.
Recibió un impacto de vertigones de goma en su rostro, afectando sus 2 ojos.
Es terrible, han destrozado una familia, han destrozado una familia. Eso han hecho estos desgraciados.
El de Gustavo es el caso de trauma ocular más grave conocido desde que comenzó el estallido social.
Estamos en guerra contra un enemigo poderoso, implacable, que no respeta a nada ni a nadie.
2 semanas antes del crimen contra mi hermano, jóvenes estudiantes indignados por el alza del transporte público comenzaron a evadir el pasaje masivamente, generando una ola de movilizaciones a nivel nacional sin precedentes y que terminó por aglutinar todas las demandas sociales existentes en Chile durante los últimos 30 años. Gustavo, mis padres y yo también salimos a las calles. Inmediatamente el gobierno asumió esto como un problema de orden público.
Hemos invocado la ley de seguridad del Estado para poder identificarlos, perseguirlos, juzgarlos y castigarlos.
Comenzaron a presentarse cientos de casos de violaciones a los derechos humanos que hicieron recordar lo peor de la dictadura de Pinochet. ¿Qué pasó con el país modelo de Latinoamérica? Chile.
La CIA financió los estudios de las escuelas de los jóvenes de Chicago para preparar un programa para el gobierno militar. Nixon and Kissinger just simply decided to change the fate of Chile.
Un ejemplo pionero en el mundo de extremismo neoliberal.
Se implantó el modelo a través del terror.
Los militares como que se burlaban, se reían, me lanzan una botella incendiaria donde me empezó a encender en pleno.
Luego se amarró una constitución y finalmente se pactó una salida democrática a la dictadura, donde se privatizaron los derechos sociales y donde la impunidad se institucionalizó en todas sus formas.
Las futuras generaciones juzgarán nuestra conducta.
...280 personas que lamentablemente han perdido la visión, al menos en un ojo. Como saben, hay un joven que pudiera perder la visión en los dos.
No hay otro evento similar desde que retornaron los gobiernos de la democracia que haya involucrado tantas situaciones de violaciones a los derechos humanos.
Esta cifra es verdaderamente aberrante.
Desde la antigüedad que la humanidad no veía un uso semejante de la ceguera como instrumento para callar a la ciudadanía.
Que Carabineros respondió a una revuelta social y a un problema de orden público con una violencia que uno podría calificar como desproporcionada.
Carabineros tuvo acciones destinadas a encubrir o a obstruir la investigación.
El caso de Gustavo es un caso complejo de investigar, pero esta investigación probablemente habría tomado una semana o un mes si es que Carabineros hubiera decidido colaborar con la investigación.
Quienes dispararon, sabemos quiénes son, están identificados y todos los antecedentes.
No está identificados los funcionarios que efectuaron los disparos a Gustavo Gatica, como él lo señala.
Voy a dar de baja por procedimiento policial. A nadie. Aunque me obliguen, no lo voy a hacer.
Un nuevo parte médico de la Clínica Santa María confirmó que Gustavo Gatica perdió completamente la visión.
Gustavo que quería que transmitiera y lo primero que me dijo es: sigan luchando, por favor, no podemos permitir que todo sacrificio, toda la sangre que se ha derramado queden en nada. Mi nombre es Enrique Gatica, soy historiador y por años trabajé investigando casos de violaciones a los derechos humanos. Esta es la historia de mi hermano Gustavo, y a su búsqueda por encontrar la verdad y la justicia. Pero también la historia de mi país, en su lucha por recuperar finalmente su dignidad.
Well, it's, sorry. Okay. So, well, I wanted to put this video because, as I told you, I think it represents the soul of the mobilizations here. This is a struggle for recovering the stolen dignity. This slogan headed the protest that began in October 2018 and still continue in Chile. Today, I will address Chile's inequality by the hand of its economic actors' behavior during 2019 and social unrest and COVID times. For this purpose, and acknowledging that the restricted time that we have, I will focus on two cases. First, the dissimilar consequences of COVID-19 for the population's health according to family income and type of social security. We'll see to what extent Pinochet's pension system showed its collapse during this crisis, leaving most of the population unprotected from the perspective of income and health. Second, we look at the government political intervention against a TV channel because of a parody of the armed forces and its role during the social crisis. This situation, particularly, has given place to a debate about freedom of expression and to what extent, the military can issue opinions about politics. So let's start with the first case. According to figures from an OECD study on Chile, the coronavirus has exacerbated economic vulnerabilities that affect half of the Chilean population, who, although not considered poor,
are at risk of poverty. It is precisely the process of deepening this inequality that the book Pinochet's Economic Accomplices, An Unequal Country by Force, developed throughout its chapters. Sometimes what appears to be a look at the past is more an explanation about the present. The main legacy of the civic military dictatorship is closely related to the implementation of an economic model that deepened economic inequality and individualism as a social ethos. In this sense, when we reflect on the social outbreak, the first thing to bear in mind is that the discomfort of the people is not associated only with a government, but with a life suffering the abuse of power, where personal effort is not enough to escape of precariousness, and where the state is unable to guarantee minimum protection of human needs. Likewise, when we observe the effects of the COVID-19 on the population, we see that high social inequality is once again the central element of the economic and health crisis. In other words, the Chilean crisis is structural. Why did people take to streets in October 2019? People went out to demand health, education, work, and pensions with decent standards. Simply put, the same protection of rights in a deeply unequal country where the level of protection depends on your level of income, that depends on your levels of income. In this context, the pandemic only showed to what extent these demands were as real as the deficiencies in the protection of so-called economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. But let's look at a specific case, the pension system in Chile. Implemented 40 years ago, is based on the fact that the administration of people's money must be handed over by legal obligation to private companies, they call AFP, that invest in the financial system to supposedly improve the amount of money with which they can retire. What has this policy meant? Well, only poverty pensions, which constitute 20% of the average salary that the worker receives throughout his life. According to social data from the Superintendency of Pensions in Chile, of course, the average pension in Chile is 300 euros. Yes, you listened well, 300 euros. The figure fluctuates significantly according to gender. Among men, the average payment is 360 euros, and in women, 220 euros. The result is simply shocking. About 80% of the pensions paid are lower than the minimum wage. Currently, with the economic crisis resulting from the pandemic, the pension funds whose administration is in the hands of private parties are falling dramatically. This means that all of us who contribute have lost money, making it even more disastrous for those closer to retirement age. In terms of health coverage, inequality also shows its worst side. In Chile, health coverage can be public or private. People assigned to the public health system, called FONASA, correspond to 75% of the population. Yes, you heard right. Those who are in the private system, called ISAPRES, pay for health insurance to receive care and benefits that are better because they have more resources and equipment. As you can imagine, during the pandemic, the vast majority of the population was limited to resorting to public hospitals with fewer resources and supplies. In short, with a collapsed with a collapsed health system, access to health and life depends on the type of health plan one had. If to this fact we add social determinants, such as that in a segregated city, the poorest sectors live in conditions that make it impossible to have the necessary care since they must go to work and take public transport, versus the higher income sectors that can work from their homes without major difficulties. Given the above, and considering the scant regulation of the health market, the risk of mortality is greater in older adults with lower incomes, who, thanks to the very poor pension system, are the vast majority of that group. It is clear there are structural factors affecting the health of the population. So, what remains in evidence? The need for the state to intervene in a system that in itself does not function as a guarantor of the rights of all people. In my opinion, the social crisis came to stress the system until it became clear that the problem in Chile is structural. I would like to close this presentation also addressing the current effects resulting from the cooperative relationship that the dictatorship established with the media system. As you can see, probably not now, but later if you buy the book, my chapter in the book, the concentration of property, media pluralism, and freedom of expression continue to be a challenge for Chilean democracy. Proof of this is the incident that took place 2 weeks ago between the Chilean army and a television channel, as a result of the diffusion of a comic representation in which the actions of the institution were criticized during the social outbreak and the violation of the human rights committed by its officials. It should be noted that there are hundreds of court cases against army and police officials for eye injuries, torture, and inhuman treatment. The army sent a letter to the television channel to express its displeasure over a parade that insults the army and its members with nothing other than the intervention of delegitimizing and degrading it, taking advantage of the facility provided by a media outlet. As a result of this action by the army, the government came out publicly, not only to support the letter, but also called the owners of the channel to express their annoyance on the content of the political parody carried out. The channel's response was to file a complaint with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights for what it considers to be undemocratic interference by the government in the free exercise of journalism and the press. Just a few days later of this, situation, the president's call to the owner of another television channel was revealed. The reason, the discomfort caused by the TV presenter's criticism of the government's handling during the health crisis. Additional to the government pressure on the press, more critical of the presidential figure is the indifference that the authorities have shown in the face of the constant threats suffered by the reporters, photographers, and other, press workers who have covered demonstrations and protests on the ground. According to data from the Observatory for the Rights to Communication, between October 2019 and March of this year, 2021, 294 cases of attacks and arrests of journalists have been registered and reported, figures that have not occurred since the time of the dictatorship. Most of these attacks have been committed by the police force. I like to end with this reflection. I hope that the cases presented help to understand the need that everything that has happened in the past and the present is not in vain, and serves to reflect and recognize that the Chilean system does not protect the human rights of all people equally, and that it's necessary to correct it from its base, hopefully starting with a constitution with all human rights at the heart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla, for this powerful presentation and for reminding us that health outcomes with COVID-19 in Chile and everywhere are the result of, or are socially determined, are the result not only of biological or personal circumstances, but also by the public policies that are in place that affect how likely we are to suffer and to be unequal in society and to suffer a disease like COVID-19. I'd like to ask a first question to the panel, and I will also encourage all of you to use this opportunity to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom page to type your questions. I noticed that there have been some, but I would like to ask the first question, if I may, and it's connecting actually these last points that Carla made and something that Lee stressed earlier, and it's about political opportunities and the constitutional reform process. How optimistic are you, the three of you, about the opportunities that this new constitution, future constitution, which we don't know what it's going to look like, but the opportunities that such constitution and the process itself may bring to hold those accountable hold accountable those who were responsible for crimes and for corporate responsibility, and also to change things, to change the fact that Chile is such a profoundly unequal country, and we've gone through more than 2 years or nearly 2 years of profound reflection in the country, and now soon there will be a constitutional convention in the country, and next year perhaps, or sometime later, there will be a new constitution that people will have to vote on. How likely is this process? How likely is it that this process will contribute to change the structures that made some people responsible and accountable, and the country so unequal as it is now? I know it's a tricky and difficult question, but I would really love to hear your thoughts about that.
I go first, probably?
May I go?
Please.
Go, Carla. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I'm optimistic. Maybe I shouldn't, but I am. I was here in Chile during the social outbreak, and this is not only about the constitutional process as it's such. It's about the end of the Pinochet constitution. It's a new start. Probably we won't have everything in terms of we won't have guarantees of equality for pensions, for health system, for education system, but we need to end with some, specific issues that are in the constitution that entails that the whole system, in terms of in economic way and a political way, it becomes a kind of neoliberal system if you want to put it in that way. And we need to finish with that, you know. We need to finish with that model, because of, as I say in my presentation, the individualism is part of this social ethos, and we are being living with this the last 30-40 years. So to think in another model of society, to do that, you need to rebuild the foundations of the society. And I think this is a possibility to do that. Probably we are not fill all the expectations, but at least it's a start. So in that sense, I'm optimistic.
Juan Pablo, Lee?
I'd be happy to jump in. I was going to link your question to Elvira. So Juan Pablo, if you want to go first, that's fine. Then I will link those two questions.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay, great.
Yes, we can, yeah.
Well, we human rights defenders and activists know that truth is compelling. So the more we, the people, know about the links between economic complicity of the past and current radical levels of inequality, the more powerful the progressive constitutional agenda will be. And I think this idea linking a better understanding of the deep roots of the current inequality linked to the past, somehow summarized in this lemma expression. It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years. And I can see at least two fields or areas where there is a growing and increasing consolidation of these links between the past accountability issue and current and future levels of inequality. One is pension system. I think everybody understands the private pension system imposed during the dictatorship is deeply linked to the current living condition of most people in the country. And the other issue is collective labor rights. We know that the dictatorship was very harsh in the sense of eroding not only individual but also collective labor rights, and I think people are realizing how important collective labor rights are in terms of ensuring decent minimum material conditions for the lives. So hopefully these two issues at the very least are somehow incorporated in the constitutional process, and some strong definition in terms of redistributing resources in the country are formally recognized in the new constitution.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Lee, I think you wanted to connect this with the question that Elvira has asked, right? So let me read the question to everyone, if I may. So Elvira Dominguez Redondo asks, fascinating findings and research, Lee. Would you say that the surprises and/or the apparent lack of visibility are a reflection of the lack of visibility of these countries in the international arena, international with inverted commas? Perhaps this is just the normal consequence of processes happening mainly at domestic level and not in English-speaking countries or in countries where researchers and other stakeholders don't enjoy from the benefits of a big microphones in the transnational arena.
Yes, so I think it's a good hypothesis, but I don't think it holds up to empirical evidence, because I think that even when there has been a microphone in the big transnational arena, let's say, I don't know, maybe Essex isn't a big microphone in a big transnational arena, but there have been a lot of these, still there's a lack of visibility. And I think on one level, it may be that there is visibility when there's pushback by economic actors, right? So, for example, there was a decision on Volkswagen's role in torture in Brazil and a settlement in that case. There was a decision on the Ford Motor Company in Argentina and convictions of two of the top managers of Ford. There has been a decision on Chiquita in Colombia and their role with the paramilitary. So we can think of these cases that have received some visibility, but they've mainly received visibility not only because they happened in the international arena, but also because the companies themselves pushed back against them. And so the press picked them up and there was mobilization about them. So one argument may be that these cases get more attention when they involve international companies than when they do involve domestic companies. And mostly the cases we look at, but not uniquely, are domestic. And actually, I shouldn't say that. There is a good split between domestic and international. But I think more of a problem is that nobody reads Truth Commission reports. No one reads the final reports by truth commissions. They look for the short summaries. And if you look at the short summaries, you won't see that this many companies were named. That takes academic research, somebody or practitioners who have the time to go through and read these. And there's no reason for companies to push back against that because no one reads them, right? And so they are, in that sense, they are held accountable in text, but they aren't held accountable in public opinion because of the lack of visibility. But I also think that it'll be interesting to know whether academic research, when it does expose these accountability mechanisms, will make any difference. And one would hope so, except that I was told that I probably need to find a lawyer for when I get sued for libel. Because that's what companies do. They carry out these sort of efforts at silencing the reports. If you look at the Ecuador case, the Chevron case in Ecuador, the amount of time and energy and money that went into suppressing the lawsuit and suppressing the lawyers who were bringing that case and NGOs that were involved in that case. These SLAP suits, as they're called, are meant to bog down academics, practitioners, legal advocates, NGOs in fighting against libel instead of fighting for justice. So there may be a bit of I would say, a risk in taking on this research. And yet there's also, a very important human rights practitioner, lawyer, and advocate has now started working with Chevron because they think they're doing neutral legal work, but it also means that Chevron is paying a lot of money for this kind of work, and that's a strategy that can be used. I think that another explanation, Elvira, for this case of silence may be that these kinds of processes that I'm talking about are not seen as business and human rights, right? They're seen as isolated cases. They are not seen as a sort of pattern of holding companies responsible for violating human rights. And as long as they can be seen as that, not a pattern of accountability, but rather an aberration, then we don't see this building of a set of tools and a set of practices that can be used in a number of cases. And one other bit of evidence that I wanted to present that might fall into that category is the case of Berta Cáceres. Berta Cáceres in Honduras is one of the cases that gets a ton of attention. but still there's impunity, right? And so I think that, you know, it's not only about, in fact, what we are finding is that actually this mobilization from below is getting more and more attention, but it's getting that attention when it's also linked to practices that are happening elsewhere. And that gets to Koldo's question about constitutions. I'm not a lawyer, but I share with a lot of lawyers this doubt that law itself is going to make anything happen. Law in the books is not law in action. And so it would be great if there were law in the books, but there still has to be law in action. So even if something gets implemented in the Constitution, we have to see that as a tool, not as an end in itself. And how we're going to use that tool to begin to advance the ideas of victims' rights to truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition is how we have to use those constitutional rights. And so laws alone, we can have laws and as we've seen around the world, still impunity prevails, right? And I think one of the most telling cases of this is a recent, well, not so recent anymore, but a decision on an Argentine firm in Ledesma that went through all of the lower courts. And when it finally got on the argument that the statute of limitations do not apply to these cases of human rights violation, and the top court in Argentina decided, the high court in Argentina decided that the statute of limitations do not apply to labor law cases, right, to violations of labor. So, you know, and that's incorporated, that's an international human rights standard incorporated into domestic law. And still the interpretation is what becomes problematic, not the existence of the law.
Thanks very much, Lee, for this detailed response. I'd like to ask a question. It's slightly different. It's a question for the three of you, and it's a little bit more of a reflective question collectively. Let me explain. The book, Juan Pablo, and let me show again the screen of the book because I think it's quite the cover is quite telling. Bear with me. Hold on a second. So hopefully you can see the cover of the book. So this book is dedicated, Juan Pablo, to Antonio Cassese, who 40 years ago began to write this book. It says, and I want to ask the three of you about this precisely. So Antonio Cassese wrote this report in 1978 on the impact of foreign economic aid and assistance on the Chilean regime, and it was a report that was. I would say very avant-garde, really, in the human rights practice, combining methodological rigor with, acknowledging economic and social rights in a way that was uncommon for the standards of the time. Maybe it wouldn't be so much right now, but it was for the human rights community in the late 70s, and also combining transitional justice principles with human rights and this methodological rigor. And the report talked about a cyclic relationship between the economic assistance, international economic assistance that sustains the regime for so long, and at the same time, the regime pushed for certain economic policies that facilitated or encouraged international investors to invest in Chile, and therefore continue with this wheel of human rights violations that were reinforcing the regime. And I suppose the question I'd like to ask the three of you is why is it that with these exceptions, and maybe a few other exceptions, by and large, acknowledging the economic structures of human rights abuses have gone pretty much unnoticed for a lot of human rights practitioners for a very long time, until, with very honorable exceptions, obviously, but until rather recently, reports like Antonio Cassese's were quite exceptional not only in the UN, but in the international human rights community. How you know, in hindsight, how do you explain these choices and these silences?
May I?
Yes, of course. Well, Juan Pablo, you are one of these wonderful exceptions, of course.
Yeah, no, this is a very important question. It's a crucial one. Philip Alston a few years ago wrote a piece reflecting on what Cassese did and what happened to him and to his report, because the report has been just missed, gone for decades, you know, after he presented it to the Subcommissioner Human Rights. And Philip Alston also reminded us that Cassese didn't get the re-election as a special rapporteur for Chile. So these two facts are telling us a lot about the political resistance, in particular from developed industrialized country to link economic, in particular finance, to human rights. And this is a political pattern that is still in place when you see the way in which industrialized countries vote both in the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council resolutions linked to finance and human rights. You name it, votes of funds, illicit financial flows, debt restructuring, etc., etc. But I think Naomi Roth-Arriaza is there. She has written trying to answer to this question, why has been missing for so many years this link between transitional justice and the economic dimension. And also Elvira with Magdalena Sepúlveda wrote a chapter on the role of special procedures trying to address this issue. And I think Elvira is also participating in this event.
Thank you, Juan Pablo.
Yeah, I think I would like to just, you know, there's a temptation to say a single word answer, which is power, but I won't do that. They really, the capacity, and what we were able to track is the capacity of economic actors to silence some of these reports. And I'd say there's also, and Juan Pablo was hinting at this, the kind of political linkages, social linkages, et cetera. So it doesn't depend on business alone, but a kind of ideological perspective that comes from, you know, still believing that economic actors are operating only in, you know, in a sort of development mentality and don't commit these kinds of atrocities, I think is what is in fact behind a lot of this effort. In fact, I was going to add in my last comment that what we've been finding in terms of business actions today is that the ability to hone your own legal team to defend the company and to protect the company has become maybe a more effective way than using violence, because you can be held accountable for violence. But using these kind of legal tools and the amount of money that can go into, especially large firms, in using these legal tools just becomes another way of fighting. You know, this is very much along the lines of C. Wright Mills and the power elite, the kind of networks that economic actors have that allow them to fight on a number of different spheres, that increases their power, not just economic power, but social, political power as well. And you know, Juan Pablo's work on the financial sector, but also some work that's coming out of South Africa by Open Secrets and the use, you know, we've toyed with the idea of carrying out a project that's on blood banking. You know, we think about blood diamonds, but do we think about blood banking and the way in which the banking industry has profited quite literally from working with repressive regimes and in armed conflicts shows the kind of capacity to not only carry out this work, but also then to silence endeavors to bring accountability for it.
Thank you, Lee. Carla?
Yeah, I think that Casses's work, the value of his work is that he links, the action of these economic actors to be part of the repression in terms of human rights. But at the same time, if you see, at least in Chile, now, the same economic actors are part of the repression in terms of they support the current government. And still, yesterday, one of the head of this, entrepreneurs, association said that the problem was the immigration, and Chile was poorest than yesterday because of the immigration. So there is a kind of logic that I think that clashes with human rights values. Not all, of course. I'm not saying that all the economic actors think in this way, but I think in Latin America, the equation, repression, economic actors, it's a common thing, sadly. So the work of Cassese, it's wonderful in terms of it's not only worried about violations of human rights in terms of disappearances or things like that. He's looking at the big picture in terms of what is going on with the system, with the political and economic system. And I think the value is in that terms, it's incredible. So yeah.
Thanks very much, Carla. It's always important to honor the work of those who paved the way for the rest of us. We are approaching the end of the time. Time flies in events like this. But I'd like to give the chance to the three of you and to conclude, if you have any final reflective notes to share with us. Juan Pablo, Lee, or Carla, don't feel pressured, although I am pressuring you, but if you have any final thoughts, please. Yes, Carla.
I want to go first because I think that hopefully in Chile we'll have a peaceful conventional process, but still in other countries in Latin America, for example, Colombia today, not tomorrow, today, they are living a very serious situation in terms of human violation, human rights violation, and they are fighting in a way for the same that we did in Chile. Human rights, it's about equality in the end, for me at least. And I think that we should pay attention in human rights studies as a whole in this sense, because it's something that it's going on now. It's not only happening in Chile, it's happening in Colombia, and probably it's going to happen in other countries too. So this inequality, it's a problem for those who believe in human rights. And yeah, in that terms, I think that we should think about it.
Thank you, Carla.
Yes, I would thank you for that, Carla. I think it's very important to think that, the work that is going on in Chile, I think already has resonated regionally, and this is a very hopeful process, and one where we have to lend a lot of support. And I think coming out of the Chilean protests, the language of, no son 30 pesos, son 30 años is really important for all of us who are studying transitional justice, to not just think about the period of the dictatorship and the armed conflict, but also the legacy and what was put in place during those years of dictatorship and armed conflict that involve a continuous struggle for these rights that are so crucial to transitional justice, as the rights to truth, the rights to justice, the rights to reparation, but also the rights, the guarantees of non-repetition. And that guarantee of non-repetition may be one of the areas where we have to do the most work now, is moving forward, thinking about the future, using what we've learned from the past to think about these new challenges for justice. Thanks.
Thank you. Juan Pablo?
Yeah, I would like to pick one idea that mentioned Lee earlier. Changing laws and writing books has been important in this field, but even more important is getting involved in politics, trying to change things on the ground. And I think a great opportunity is opening up for us in the constitutional process in Chile. That's why it's so important to make the case through all the channels we have available in this constitutional process, that past is linked to the present and therefore to the future. So if we are going to discuss how to ensure the realization of economic and social rights, we have to discuss, we must incorporate into this discussion accountability for economic accomplices, because they are the main responsible for the deficits in terms of violation of economic and social rights in the present. And thanks a lot, Goldo, for these opportunities, for organizing this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Juan Pablo, Carla, and Lee. I will finish with a note to our attendees and participants and those who will be watching it on YouTube later. In the next 2 months, we are going to have 2 outputs from the Human Rights Center at Essex. Firstly, we're going to have a report from our Human Rights Clinic, where students have been looking at examples from comparative practice from Kenya, from Tunisia, from Iceland, from Ireland, from Mexico, of how to encourage participatory processes in processes of constitutional reform and significant political processes. So that's one thing that will hopefully will be published and will be out in about a month or a month and a half. And secondly, together with the University of Concepcion in Chile and with the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, towards the end of June, beginning of July, we will publish a collection of studies. It will be in Spanish, but next year some of them will be in English. They will be 30 plus contributions, half of them international authors, half of them Chilean authors, on examples of constitutionalizing social rights, looking at examples from around the world, how they have done it in other countries, and what that constitutionalization of social rights might mean in practice for law and policy development in Chile. So watch this space. In a few weeks, it will be online, and we will talk about it all in events like this in the future. So thanks again, Carla.
Yeah,
and go ahead, Carla.
Please do come to Chile. I think this process, probably not now, but this is a long process. It would take around 3 years, because it's not only the year of the assembly, it's a long, way. So you're very welcome.
Okay. Well, thank you. We'll take that invitation. We will try. Thanks again for those of you who have been watching, and thanks again, Juan Pablo, for the idea, and Lee and Carla and Juan Pablo for being with us today. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.